So the book begins with a story set in 1989. In the spring of that year, a group of students began to slowly make their way to Beijing, to Tiananmen Square, which for the Chinese people, for centuries upon centuries, was the place of gathering to ask a question: has the mandate of heaven come down upon our political leaders, on our governmental leaders? And either to say it has, we bless this, we acknowledge this, or to call into question whether the mandate from heaven actually was in place for this regime of the Chinese leadership. So in '89, these students gathered in Tiananmen Square, long history behind them, asking the question, can we talk to you, political leaders that you are, about what China is and what it might be in the future? And the government refused to talk to them, frankly and tragically. And after several months of being there, and the crowd began to grow into thousands upon thousands of students, on one tragic night in June, the tanks rolled in, and God alone knows how many were killed that night. But some made it out, and some of the leaders made it out. And a few years later, I was asked to spend an evening talking to them about a question they had. And the question was this. Strange as it might sound to us, they kept saying, you see, we love China. We love China. We love China. We have suffered. We've had our friends in our arms bloodied and dying. But you see, we love China. We want to be part of its future someday. But we have a question for you. We want a basis, a philosophical reason that could make sense of a choice to go back into a place where we might suffer and even might die, which we will do because of our love for China. But we want a good reason that makes sense of that. We've been asking the philosophers of the world, does your philosophy have a good understanding of this? Can it answer this question? We haven't had a good answer yet. We wonder whether Christianity has a better answer to that question. Which you can imagine for me was a very sober question to be asked. And I sat there for quite a while thinking through, what am I saying to them, really? Well, the book begins with that story, and it walks its way into a lot of people I've known and places I've been, and in various ways, people who have seen both, the worst of the world, but also, maybe in very ordinary ways too, in very ordinary places, people who have taken up the challenge of living in a broken world, a wounded world, and have said, well, now that I know, what am I going to do, really? I framed this in a chapter that I've called The Landscape of Our Lives by looking at what I've called, on the one hand, the culture of whatever, which is a modern, becoming postmodern world with anime being the state of things where there's really are no standards, there's no norms left. We really are up to you and to me to decide what we will believe about anything, actually. But another side of that, of this landscape that I've argued for, is what we could call the information age, or the info glut culture, and have made the argument that, in a surprising way, the more we know about the world, the less interested in it we are. The more we know, the less we care about the world. The more we know, the more numbed we feel by what we know. And that's a hard place to be if we are Christian people, actually. The more we know about this world God made, the more numbed we are to it. Well, I've spent a chapter looking at the Hebrew vision of knowing, which is remarkable and deep and profound. That if we have knowledge of, it means we have responsibility to, it means we have care for. That works its way all the way from Genesis to Malachi, actually. But then there's a chapter on the New Testament, the gospel vision of knowledge, of knowing, and looking at particularly at the Gospel of John and asking, how does God in Christ know in this gospel we call John? What does it mean when Jesus knows? What can we learn from the knowing of Jesus? I've told story upon story of friends I have who, in their own different ways, ordinary people in ordinary places, who take up their own lives and have, as I have argued, have touched the hurt and the wound and the brokenness of life, and have not stepped away, but have actually decided, now the more I know, the more I care, the more implicated I see myself to be. I think there are a couple of great temptations for all of us. And there's a chapter called The Great Temptations. And it looks at stoicism and cynicism, which I would argue are both ways of responding to that most perennial of all temptations in the garden, this epistemological temptation with a moral heart that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is. Because Stoicism and cynicism both allow us to say, of course I know. I know. Yeah, of course I know. I'm not naive, I'm not stupid. Of course I know. But they allow us to protect our hearts from the implications of what we know. We don't have to be responsible for what we know because we don't want to be. We'd rather not be. It will hurt too much, actually, to be responsible for this, to acknowledge, in fact, that I know this. In the strange dynamic of Romans chapter 1, it says that we know, we actually do know, we know enough, but we repress what we know because we don't want to have to be responsible for what we know. The very last part of the book is a chapter that I've called Learning to Live Proximately. And it really is my own best effort at trying to make sense of what do we do in this now but not yet world. This already but not yet world, this world where Jesus has come to make all things be new, and yet the creation itself still groans and we still groan. Now what do you do with that, actually? And so I've told some stories of people who I know pretty well, who have in their own different ways made choices, hard choices as they've been, but to live proximately, to live as if doing something is a good thing, even if they already know ahead of time everything isn't a possibility. We don't have a theology that argues for everything, for perfection. Our theology says, in fact, until Jesus comes, it'll be a now but not yet world. So I really have set forth a vision of vocation that takes its place within that now but not yet world. And what do? Well, we have to learn to live proximately. We have to learn to make peace with proximate justice in the public square. We have to learn to make peace with proximate happiness in even the best of marriages. Because even in the best of marriages, they're not perfect marriages. A perfect love isn't found, really. Even with very good and happy and long-lasting marriages, perfection isn't a possibility. What do you do then when it's not perfect? I think proximate's a good word for us because it allowed us to hold on to something which is honest and real and touchable and tangible, even if it isn't everything. And we all need that if we're going to keep at it, to keep out our vocations in this world.